Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's session where we'll be talking about a practical and tactical approach for crawl, walk, run towards spare parts master data management. Now, this has been a topic that I've seen year over year come up in different shapes and sizes. And it's something that we really wanted to just focus in on and take all of our experience that we've seen from different industries, different customers at different maturity stages and levels, and different types of outcomes, right? If someone has decided to wait and put a project on pause for different data management reasons, what was that outcome? And we wanted to package all that up together and bring it today in the form of this webinar to kind of bring it to the market and kind of let you all know and be aware of what truly is, the dragging factor when it comes to taking projects forward that might be defining successful or not successful in terms of their completion. So with that being said, today's agenda, we'll just go through a quick short introduction of myself, and then we'll get right into the content. We'll talk a little bit about the main problem that we like to call the paralysis problem, and we'll get into the framework around sort of relating data management to a puzzle. And you'll see exactly what I mean when we get there in a second. Lastly, we'll recap with sort of the four main things to take away from this session, and then we'll end with Q&A. So an important thing to realize is that this whole session is rooted in ISO 55000 principles and concepts that can be applied towards taking that next step for data maintenance maturity. So who am I? My name is Mateo Canarte-Toro. I'm the head of sales here in COSOL Americas. And I've spent the past 6-7 years in different organizations, but mostly always focusing on supply chain. My background is I'm an industrial and systems engineer. And before being at COSOL, I was previously at IBM working on the global teams there. Again, surfacing clients from energy and utilities to transport to oil and gas all over the world. So I've seen different problems and sometimes the same problem in different disguises. But the common thing that I've always surfaced when I've sat across the table from maintenance managers, materials managers, VPs of supply chain, procurement directors, etc. Somehow it's always rooted back to a single sort of statement. And that statement has always been, well, we'd love to go and take on this project, but our data is just simply not ready yet. Or, we're currently working on this data master cleanup project initiative. We need to put everything else on pause right now. And I've seen both sides of the coin. I've seen an organization that has been small, nimble, and wanting to take an agile approach to, fixing what they know is going to move the needle the most, and still taking on projects that they know that can unlock a lot of capital, working capital for their organization. And then I've seen some organizations that might have stopped a little bit. Maybe they had other initiatives that were taking precedent, or they decided to put all their effort and time into a master data cleansing project that might have taken 2-3 years. And then when it finally came around and they were able to do the things they wanted to do before, the situation got a little bit worse. So that is the premise of today's conversation, is that when we talk about data being ready, I really want to challenge what ready actually means. Because if we take a look at ISO 55000 and all the different types of principles that we can apply, we can notice that there really is a different definition that I think we all should be steering towards. So let's begin with the problem, right? Like we mentioned, most of us, we do it in our daily lives. We do it at work. Sometimes we can't help it. It's just human nature. You tend to hesitate right at the starting line. Right? You tend to hesitate, you tend to overthink, you start to think, you know what, I just need to get everything perfect. I need to get everything ready. And then once I'm ready, I can go and take that next step. Well, the problem is that perfect data is really a destination that doesn't really exist. If you think about the tons and tons of data that we're collecting today, specifically when it comes to maintenance, right? That's growing at an exponential level. And trying to put guardrails around that once it's already grown to the size that it has becomes a very big problem. And then starting to perfect it and clean it on day one doesn't necessarily guarantee that that's going to be the way that it is on day 2 and day 3, right? We obviously want to fix that with governance. But when we start to think about, we have to get to perfect, we're already behind the 8 ball. And what I've seen by the organizations that really move the needle is that they don't wait, they iterate. They realize that there's a process to how they need to uh, sort of formalize the data maintenance cleansing project, and starting with the most important things that they know are going to move the needle for their organization. And it all goes back to ISO 55000. The organizations need to sit down and identify all the external and internal issues that are relevant to the business problems and the purpose that it's set out to achieve, right? In the interest of its asset management system. That is the key. What is relevant to help us move the needle, to help us get to the next, the first quarter mile of that racetrack once we're off the starting line. And then we can pass the baton and continue to iterate and work as a team. Every month that we spend waiting on perfect is a price tag that we're paying. It's an opportunity cost. If you look at MRO spare parts specifically, sometimes the value of those parts are instantly starting to decrease, and you're still paying a holding cost to maintain them on the shelves. So if you are not having the right reorder points, the right inventory levels, right, 20 to 30% of that MRO inventory that's sitting on the shelf at any plant or any site can typically go in excess, or it might even become obsolete before you know it. So the waiting game, while it may seem like, we're focused on a better project first, we need to get this right, can actually have inadvertent effects of just waiting too long and not taking the proper actions to continue to iterate as we move forward. So how do we solve this problem, right? How do we kind of put together a true and tested data cleansing, data management framework that our organization can adopt? I like to refer to it as a puzzle. Now, I'm not a puzzle fanatic myself. I've done maybe a 100 piece puzzle, 500 piece puzzle, and that is it. I don't go much further in the numbers than that. But I have a lot of friends who have taken on the challenge of doing 1,000 piece puzzles, 5,000 piece, 10,000 piece puzzles. And it blows my mind because the more that I talk to them, I started to really identify a pattern of what the best, puzzle people kind of put together, what the best people that work on these puzzles do. And that is that they have the simple framework that they always abide by. What's the one thing that you never do when it comes to starting a puzzle? Is that you don't pick your random piece and you just start at the middle, right? That is a recipe for disaster. And the reason behind that is because you have no sense of depth, of space, of how big the problem is. And that is why you always start with the edges. You want to look at that box, that lid of the puzzle piece, and you want to identify what are the edge pieces that I can immediately find, have a smooth corner that I can start to place around my table and start to really see how big the problem is. That is step number one. You always start with the edges, and then you start to create and border in that problem. Now, what's the next step? You still don't click for that random piece, right? You have a sense of dimension and kind of direction based on the framework, but you go and you look for the items that stand out the most. I like to call those the hot spots, the section clusters. If you're doing a puzzle that has a bright red lighthouse, those are the pieces that you want to find because you know that they're the most important and they can, again, add more dimension and depth to the problem that you're trying to piece. So you start to build out those section clusters, and you can see it here in the picture on the right. This is actually from Guinness Book of World Records, where a team together, I believe it was in Portland, Oregon, attempted to go and get a 10,000 piece puzzle done in the quickest amount of time. Now, after you build in those section clusters, you might have already put in 16 hours, 24 hours worth of time. The last thing that you want to do is have someone walk by the puzzle, flip an edge, knock it over, and everything sort of falls down to the floor, right? You don't want that to happen. So what do? That's when you bring in the sort of the frame and you start to box in that puzzle and protect it so that you know that every piece coming in after that is going to be guarded, it's going to be safe, and it's going to overall contribute to the construction of the final solution, the final puzzle that you're trying to solve. So today we're going to walk through each of these crawl, walk, run methodologies and sort of give you more in-depth as to how you treat your data management like a 10,000 piece puzzle. Because if you think about it, it really is. It's a big problem. There's so much data that's sitting there. So we want to make sure that it's digestible, it's palatable, and you can start to work towards that final outcome. Now, ISO 55000 clause states here that, again, the purpose of the system is not to set it and forget it, but it's to continually improve the adequacy and the effectiveness of that asset management program. And this is why that crawl walk methodology is so important, because now you get to run, right? There might be a point where you have to kind of get back to start number one, and you can continue to iterate as you go. So, crawl, find the edges. We've done here at COSOL, we've done a numerous amounts of sort of data health checks, if you will. And we've come across sort of 6 major tenets that we believe are the key to kind of identifying what those edges are and adding a sense of depth to how big the problem is. And those 6 you can see here on the slide, they come across as duplication, very common. I think a lot of you have kind of shared on the pre-meeting consensus that that is a big issue that you're facing. But you think about same part, multiple records, right? BRG 1000, maybe spelled out bearing 1000, all the same bearing, just different names and descriptions based on free text that was allowed to kind of come into the system. The second sort of falls hand in hand, but it's standardization. Is that there's no consistent naming convention that's been defined by the organization. And that also leads to problem number one, which you saw was duplication. Now, the next layer is completeness. You might have some items that just don't have unit of measure, don't have eaches, don't have commodity codes, or any sort of things that people are not plugging in. Maybe it's not a required attribute on the point of entry, but it's missing key attributes that could be pivotal for further analysis down the line. Then you have integrity, broken relationships, no asset linkage. Maybe they're not on the bottom materials, no active bin locations, etc. Redundancy, this is key, especially when you're talking about that 20 to 30% of items that might be going obsolete. How much inventory are we still carrying on the books that is completely obsolete? It's providing no value. It hasn't been used in the past 3 to 5 years, and we're still sitting there in the system taking active safety stock. And then lastly, this is sort of the inheritor of all the previous 5 attributes, but it's just incorrect. That's the dimension that we call it. Maybe it has the wrong values. Maybe because over time things have changed and the current min and max parameters are just haven't been unchanged since the beginning of the inception of that asset management system. Very popular problem that I've seen with different customers, and that is the one thing that we want to go and classify. So when we take a data management approach to kind of your organization, we come in and we look at across these 6 dimensions, and we can start to see where the hotspots really are. We can start to identify, okay, do we have a duplication issue? Is it an integrity problem? How big is this problem, and kind of what is the most important piece of that? And this is an example of a real-world assessment that we did for a pretty big transit agency that has been, again, doing this for many, many years, a sophisticated team, an industry standard software solution. And we went in there, and in just a week, we started to kind of put, again, data to how big this problem could be. We identified the impact. We identified how many remediation items were in need, but also that we prioritized what needs to be looked at immediately on day 1, what can be pushed to the burner on day 2, and what doesn't even probably have to be addressed because it's not going to carry any weight moving into the next objectives that the organization has defined. So here you can see cataloging was an issue, right? But it wasn't necessarily a priority that had to be fixed. Maybe it was a symptom of another one of these issues that we saw here across warehouse management, across purchasing, different work orders and standard jobs, etc. This is important because ISO 55000 also states that documented information is supposed to be the source of confidence and trust that helps carry out these processes that we have defined. So by having the state defined before you go on to this, start to walk and run, you can now see where you were, what needs to be done on day 1, what needs to be done on day 2, and start to work towards that process that you can then compare and have concrete confidence in those processes and documents later on at the end of the project. So now that you have this sort of map, right, that tells you, okay, where do I go first? What's the first pit stop that I go and take? The best solutions out there don't just give you a report. They need to show you density. They need to show you where those problems lie, how big those problems are, and what the outcomes could be. And this is important for two reasons. One, I think everyone's been in that position before where you might go to leadership and say, we have a data problem, right? And what do they say? Okay, how are you going to fix it? This changes the conversation because now you can come with concrete examples of saying, we have a duplication problem, we have an integrity problem, and you can pinpoint those exact hot spots and take it to leadership to get the buy-in, as opposed to it being a massive data issue. You now have funneled and attentive areas that you can go and dedicate resources to turn this around. So the best assessments, again, don't just list those problems, they show you where the density is. And here at COSOL, we have one of those tools that we actually bring to the forefront as part of our engagements, where we can go and analyze all the data and give you those remediation scores, see how hard it will be to fix those problems, see how easy it will be to fix others, and the overall data quality score that'll be the very first part of that process. And you can also drill down, right? This is the high level, this is a leadership example that you can put on that table, but you need to have the drill down capability to get into each of those tenets, each of those pillars, and start to identify, okay, based on evidence, based on data, this is the starting point that we have, and we can get stakeholder buy-in to help align to those broader asset management objectives. So now that we have the evidence, right, now we have to build those clusters. And what are the rules to build those clusters? We talked about the lighthouse seeing the red shiny roof. We talked about, maybe identifying some other key identifiers in that puzzle piece. And that is step number one. In order to identify the clusters, you need to prioritize. Prioritize, prioritize, prioritize. Prioritize ruthlessly. And what I mean by that is that ISO 55000 has the rule of proportionality embedded into it that is super key, right? You don't treat the data quality, completeness, and importance and integrity of a $3 gasket the same way that you treat a $300,000 motor, right? They both have completely different outcomes and they're completely different impacts and criticality to your business. And the one thing that we notice is that when you make the level of effort for data collection full of pit stops and full of friction for those end users that are collecting it, it's going to drive bad data. If you think about how many times have you gotten a survey after you've been approached by someone at the mall, or you've bought a new product and they say, we just have a quick 5-minute survey, and then it's 20,000 questions that you have to go down and fill out, you're likely to just exit out or just fill in random things to kind of get through that process, right? And that's not the point of the objective. So that's where you need to start to realize, what data are we looking at? What item are we looking at? What asset does this roll up to? How does it impact our business? And prioritize and start to identify that, okay, these are the items that we need to prioritize with 100%, these attributes being included. These items can maybe take a back burner or have some optional items that need to be included. Not gonna make or break our organization, but you want to spend your time fixing the data that's going to drive the outcome. And that's what helps eliminate the 80% of noise that you might be spending some time on, and help you focus on that 20% of items that actually move the needle. And those key attributes, right? Like commodity codes, unit of measures, manufacturer part numbers, linkages, etc. Every other mandatory field that you add on to that, past that point, is just friction. And friction is going to be the first thing that kills compliance and kills governance when you get into that run stage that we'll talk about shortly. Then, step number 2. Okay, you've prioritized, you started to identify what items need to be standardized, maybe moved. The biggest fall off that I see for different customers happens at this step. And you think about it, right? We have 5+ years of history for this asset. Some organizations I've seen 20+. And then they want to move to a new asset system or a new inventory optimization system, whatever it may be. And they get somehow talked into starting net new, bringing in just the new cleansed data and migrating it over. That is a big issue, because you have a lot of rich information that's sitting in those separated sort of item history records. If you think about it, you have a BRG 1000 and you have bearing 1000. It's the same item, but they have completely separate consumption histories. If you only take one and migrate it over, you're missing out on half the story. and half the story that's pivotal to making those final decisions when it comes to how much we should be stocking on the shelves for this part. So deleting the duplicates is a very big issue. You want to start to kind of identify how you can bring and preserve and merge that history over and make that the priority before you now start to go down the path of archiving and flagging as duplicates. The best systems that I've seen should have this built natively in. If they do not, that is a big, big issue, right? You still want to have the ability to merge those items together. If you know that bearing 1000 is the standard that you're going to be moving forward, BRG is not, you want to move the history from BRG into bearing 1000 and then flag and archive, BRG maybe separately as a separate thing in case you need it with the full audit trail. That is the biggest next step that I think a lot of organizations tend to miss out on. That is key to accelerating the walk to run. And then lastly, we get to standardized naming, right? This is the lid on the puzzle box. This is the rules of the game. This is what everyone going from this day forward has to abide by. We know we're building this puzzle. We know we're building this picture with the lighthouse, with the lake, with the sun on the right. That is the rule book. So need to have this, and you need to have it agreed upon across the organization. Now, there's a recommended MRO format, but you also want to make sure that in those naming conventions, they're published, they're visible, they're enforced, but most importantly, they're using the mandated fields that you actually use in decisions, in queries, get input from the end user that how are they looking up items? So you make sure that that is built into the process of how you're standardizing these items for fast and easier searches. This is an example of preserving history. So IBM Maximo Inventory Optimization has it natively built in. It's been around for 30 plus years. But this is key because as you can see here, I can identify what the source material is, meaning one of the duplicates, what the destination material is going to be, and I can click that item and that option to move my receipt over. So I'm taking all that rich history of how many times I bought it, who I bought it from, at what time, what were the lead times, what was the outcome, what was the consumption history, moving all of that over so that now when I go and move forward on the new part, I'm not missing any days of history and I can still count that into my full picture. All right. So now we've crawled, we built our frame, we start to build in the hotspots. Now we got to get into governance, which is how do we keep that puzzle together? We've done all this work. We've identified what is the priority. And now we need to get to the point where we make sure that no one walks by and that puzzle just, all that hard work comes crashing down on the floor. I've seen lots of different governance structures across the different organizations that I work with. They come in different shapes and sizes, but the overall framework that I've seen that has been the most effective typically follows this structure. You have your data stewards, right? It's the day-to-day champions. It's the one that are plugging in this data, that are investigating or remediating different types of issues and enforcing the naming standards across the organization. Then you have the data owners. And the data owners typically are those materials managers, the procurement leads, and they are the ones that are accountable for the quality in the business domain. And this is key, right? Because it's a business function, not IT. The business now ultimately sees how that data impacts the day-to-day operations. And that's why it's important to have that buy-in at that level, that they can start to see how that information is coming in and make sure that all further approvals, decisions are accountable and how that data is coming in. And I can't stress this enough. This is a business function role. Then you get into the overarching data governance council. And this is cross-functional. Typically, I've seen these met monthly, sometimes quarterly, but you have a recurring cadence of data governance reviews where you're coming in to see who is on the board, what decisions are you making that it continues to standardize how that data is moving forward, and you're holding each other accountable. And this is important because you're looking at if one decision in one domain is made, how is it going to affect other parts of the organization? Sometimes a criteria that might change in the supply chain house might have a pretty bad impact on the maintenance side of the house. So it's important to weigh all those options out, see the pros and cons, and identify one working data quality remediation or standardization strategy that can be applied down the organization. And then lastly, but certainly not least, is an executive steering committee. This has to be a strategic mandate. Without this, governance is going to die very quickly. I've seen it die as quick as 3 months. I've seen it die in 6. And this is the most important because even ISO 55,000 calls this out and says that top management should be able to demonstrate leadership and commitment to the respective asset management systems, making sure that all the policies and objectives are established and followed. And this is where the executive steering committee becomes a very, very big needle mover in this process. And then lastly, right, processes are one thing, but you want to make sure that you have the right tools in place that make that running and that governance a lot easier. If you think back about, the point of entry, you get that survey from that person that just, asks you to fill out 20,000 questions. You don't want to put anything in. Sometimes you put random stuff in just to get past the survey. I might be guilty of that, but the important part here is that data needs to be checked at the point of entry. Data should not be looked at after the fact because that means you've already allowed, the variant or sort of the issue to get within the four walls of the organization, and that is a no-no. You should have a system that has checks and balances at the beginning of data ingestion. So you need to look for things that have rejection workflows, things that have duplicate detection at the point of input. Maybe something is already redundant. It's taking a certain naming convention. It's already been identified, or it's maybe not allowed to even be used in that location, right? If you know that these items are not used at this site, at this manufacturing plant, or in this region, they should not be allowed to be flagged and logged in as to that specific site. And this tool has regular benefits and reviews. Now, this is a data studio tool that we also COSOL here provide. But as you can see on the right, you're getting instant data queries and checks against all the data that you're putting in. And you can see that if production XXX is typed in by accident, automatically an error shows up that shows you that is not an active type. You need to go and select from one of the active types that we have available here. Same thing, again, governance at the point of entry. I can't stress this enough. The organizations need to be able to put these plans in place and also start to evaluate the effectiveness of these actions. And that's where things like audit trails, who changed what information at what time, for what reason, workflows, and the ability to bulk update these items, right? We all know how painful it is to go through and do line item changes one by one, but the ability to do it in bulk with these checks and balances is something that the end users can buy into because they know that while I might be doing a little bit extra work, it's for a greater cause or a greater good at the end of the day. And it's not more manual work on my end. It's just making more diligence checks, more quality checks, and making sure that I'm putting governance into the reason that I'm doing it. So all in all, we covered a lot of different things in today's session. But as I want to leave you with the 4 things to remember. And one is the fact that you see this picture on the right, that team actually put together that 10,000 piece puzzle. And they did it by following the steps. You can see in the picture here, they have their outer frame, they have their hotspots identified, and they put in their separate frames in the middle to make sure that every piece is put together and kept away from danger. So if you think about the original premise of today's discussion, which was, I don't have perfect data. I can't start yet. That is one thing to start to remember, that perfect data is a destination. It does not exist. And being good enough to start today is a decision that you can absolutely make. And you can start to work that process and allow for new initiatives coming in as you take this iterative approach to data cleansing. It doesn't have to be a daunting task if you look at it the right way. First thing, assess first, act second. You need to know how big the problem is and where those major hotspots lie of those problems. Once you got a lay of the land, then you can move to step number 2, which is prioritizing. Out of those hotspots, which are going to move the needle the most for my organization if I fix tomorrow, and which ones are not going to have an impact if I choose to wait till 2 weeks from now, 6 months from now, a year from now, etc. Once I start to take action, step number 3 is preserving that history. That history is valuable. You collected that data for a reason. Making sure that you have tools in place that can allow you to leverage that history and bringing it into analysis is key. And now that you're starting to walk and you're starting to run and implement these processes and you have your steering committee set, you want to make sure that you govern at the point of entry. making sure that nothing gets on your lawn, nothing gets in your house that is not welcomed, that is not correct. All of that can be rooted back to ISO 55000, as you can see, that when a nonconformity occurs, the organization is going to take the right action to tackle that nonconformity, correct it, and ultimately deal with the circumstances and document it so that you have these processes addressed for work members that might be coming down the line in the future. So with that all being said, that is today's presentation. Hope it was valuable. I hope you learned a thing or two. And the next time you look at a 10,000 piece puzzle, just remember, you know what? I think I know of a way to kind of correct that problem. And I think I know how I can apply that to my business. So thank you all so much for your time. And if there's any questions, be happy to answer.